April 8, 1945, Austrian Alps, 5,000 feet above the ruins of a dying Reich. The morning sky was clear, a cold blue dome stretching above jagged ridgelines streaked with snow. Below, in the valley of Schwechat, the last functioning radio station of the Luftwaffe crackled faintly, its transmissions clipped and broken. Somewhere over the mountains, 3 German fighter squadrons had vanished from contact. No distress call, no acknowledgement, just silence. The kind of silence that settles after a storm has passed, or before one begins. Inside the hardened bunker, a young operator pressed the headphones tighter against his ears, adjusting the knobs on the console as if sheer willpower would pull a voice from the static. But nothing came, not a whisper, not even the ghost of engine interference. And then, through the concrete walls, came a low rumble. Not thunder, not nature, something mechanical, rhythmic, predictable, a metallic hum that vibrated through stone like an approaching train. Except it was coming from the sky. What they didn't yet understand is that this wasn't just another Allied patrol. It wasn't a formation of B-17s with sluggish escorts trying to survive the trip home. What was coming through those mountains was something else entirely. A machine forged across an ocean, refined by necessity, and unleashed not for vengeance, but for conclusion. This was the sound of finality, the sound of inevitability. The Luftwaffe was still trying to play chess. The Americans had already flipped the table. In the control center, a senior officer leaned over the young radio operator's shoulder. His face was pale, expression unreadable. He'd flown in 1940, when their planes ruled the skies above France. He'd watched his comrades rack up dozens of kills, becoming legends with every sortie. But now, in this bunker surrounded by silence, he realized something his superiors refused to admit. They no longer controlled the air. They barely existed in it. The transmission log showed the last recorded message at 7:41, a routine check-in from a formation flying north of Bruck an der Leitha. The pilot reported light clouds, fuel status, and formation integrity. 30 seconds later, a garbled line, indistinguishable. That was it. Nothing after. No visual confirmation. No radar blip. No mayday. All 3 squadrons gone. And then the sound grew louder. Residents in the nearby village of Groß-Enzersdorf described it as a metal wind, a rising, mechanical roar that seemed to roll across the mountains like an avalanche made of steel. Children ran inside. Farmers froze in the fields. Old men who had fought in 1918 stepped out of their doorways and looked to the sky, not with hope, but with the quiet recognition of what was coming. Moments later, they appeared, sleek, silver, not dozens, hundreds. P-51 Mustangs slicing through the air in tight formations, sunlight bouncing off their fuselages like polished blades. They flew low, with absolute purpose. There was no hesitation in their movement, no confusion, no wasted motion. This wasn't a search pattern. This was a declaration. And then, just as quickly as they came, they disappeared behind the peaks. But their presence lingered. The officer in the bunker removed his cap and sat down slowly, the realization settling over him like frost. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't need a recovered wreck or an intercepted recording. He had heard it. He had felt it. And in that moment, he knew what the front lines still refused to accept. The sky had changed sides. It hadn't happened in one day. It had been a slow erosion. First came the longer-range escorts, then the aggressive dogfights, and finally the near-complete suppression of German air operations. But now, for the first time, it was complete. There was no more parity, no more chance to recover. The war in the air was over, and the enemy hadn't just taken control, they had owned it. There were no more Messerschmitts diving from the sun, no more tight formations of Focke-Wulfs climbing in tandem. The Jagdwaffe had been hunted to extinction. What once was pride had become memory, and in the space left behind, a new sound had taken root, deeper, heavier, industrial. It wasn't a roar of glory. It was the hum of inevitability. The P-51 was not a symbol of American bravery. It was a symbol of American production, the result of endless resources, relentless engineering, and a strategy designed not to outmaneuver the enemy, but to replace him again and again and again. In London, Allied command tracked the silence with cold precision. They knew what had happened before it was confirmed. Intelligence reports had already labeled the Alpine corridor as compromised. The Mustangs were no longer escorts. They were executioners. In the weeks to come, surviving Luftwaffe officers would speak of the silence, of the moment when the radios went dead. Some claimed the Americans were jamming their frequencies. Others spoke of mechanical failure, sabotage, or accidents in the mountain fog. But those who had heard it, those who had felt the vibration in their chest, the metallic hum that built like a wave, they never theorized. They remembered. And in that memory, they found no strategy, no mistake, no salvation. Only the sound of the sky being claimed by someone else. If you believe history deserves to be remembered with this level of depth and emotion, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice keeps the echoes of the past alive. They had no name for it at first. No code name, no formal identification, only the sound. A low mechanical growl rising from the western sky, smooth but unrelenting, like a blade drawn slowly across steel. It was not the clunky roar of a B-17. It was not the clipped rasp of a Spitfire. This was something else, something colder. Pilots in the Luftwaffe called it the metal ghost in hushed tones. If giving it a real name might summon it. But this ghost was very real. What approached them was a shape the German pilots were not used to fearing. Long nose, razor wings, and a bubble canopy that gave its pilot full dominion over the horizon. It didn't dance or taunt like the Spitfires over Dunkirk. It didn't lumber like the Thunderbolts before Berlin. It simply arrived, and it stayed. The first encounter came quietly. February 1944. An escort group was reported accompanying a formation of B-24s over central Germany. Nothing new, except this group didn't peel away at the Rhine. It kept going, past Frankfurt, past Kassel, all the way to Leipzig. Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled, expecting the usual soft prey. Instead, they were met by an enemy that did not retreat, did not hesitate, and did not miss. 8 Messerschmitts were downed in 4 minutes. By the time German radar realized what had happened, the sky had cleared. The bombers turned back, and their escorts turned with them. Full power, full speed, no losses. Back at base, one Luftwaffe pilot said simply, "They chased us home. We have no more advantage." That was the P-51 Mustang. Its design was born not from arrogance, but desperation. The early days of the American air campaign were marked by carnage. B-17s were falling like flies over occupied Europe, shredded by flak and swarmed by enemy fighters. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, yes, rugged, definitely, but it lacked the range to follow the bombers deep into enemy territory. What the Americans needed was a sword that could follow its target to the very heart of the Reich and come back. The British had the engine, the Americans had the factory. The pairing of the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with North American Aviation's sleek new airframe created a weapon that changed the nature of aerial warfare. It wasn't just fast. It wasn't just long range. It was lethal at altitude and nimble in combat. Its .650 caliber machine guns could chew through aluminum like wet paper. And more importantly, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back without needing to refuel. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe had nowhere left to hide. Veteran German pilots soon realized they weren't facing amateurs anymore. The P-51s didn't fly in loose, vulnerable formations. They operated in disciplined pairs, using boom and zoom tactics that exploited their speed and diving power. When engaged, they didn't flinch. They attacked, repositioned, and struck again. And they never came alone. A single Mustang might be a scout. 2 were a patrol. But if you saw 4, there were 20 more not far behind. They moved with precision, with confidence, not because they were cocky, but because they knew their mission. And they knew they had the tools to complete it. The Mustang's presence also introduced a new psychological element. Its silhouette, sleek and bright against the sun, became a symbol of inevitability. German anti-air crews began to fire at shadows. Farmers in the fields would duck instinctively at the sound. Resistance fighters saw them as guardians. Axis pilots saw them as hunters. One German ace wrote in his journal, "We used to hunt. Now we are the hunted." and we cannot outrun them. But perhaps the most frightening part was not what the P-51 did, but how it did it. With efficiency. There was no drama, no theatrics. A Mustang pilot would spot his target, engage with cold precision, and climb out before the enemy could blink. Hits were often fatal. Debriefings were short. Ammunition was recorded, not bragged about. They were not flying for glory. They were flying to finish the job. And when the mission was done, they didn't linger. They turned, formed up, and vanished into the sky. The Luftwaffe had trained to fight warriors. What they met instead was a system. The American pilot of the Mustang was no better than his German counterpart in raw skill, but he was backed by something the enemy couldn't replicate. Training that never stopped, logistics that never failed, fuel that never ran out, planes that never stopped arriving. Every time one Mustang was shot down, two more took its place, not because they were more courageous, but because their factories didn't sleep. One Luftwaffe squadron leader, interviewed after the war, summed it up in a sentence. We were men. They were momentum. The Mustang wasn't just a plane. It was a message. A sleek silver envelope, delivered with high-octane certainty to the doorstep of every remaining fighter group in Hitler's Europe. The message read loud and clear. You are outnumbered. You are outflanked. You are out of time. Some tried to fight back. Others turned and ran. A few, recognizing the end, chose to dive into the fray one last time. But no matter the decision, the result was often the same. The Mustang came, the Mustang saw, the Mustang returned, and the sky, once claimed by eagles, now belonged to the horse. If this moment in history or taught you something new, consider leaving a comment and subscribing. Let us know how you felt witnessing this shift in the air war. Your voice keeps stories like this flying. In the opening weeks of 1944, laughter still echoed in the mess halls of German airfields. Pilots told stories of their latest victories, bragged about confirmed kills, and shared crude nicknames for the Americans' strange flying machines. They called the Thunderbolt a flying milk bottle. The P-38 was a twin-tailed scarecrow. And the P-51? They barely mentioned it. Too new, too few, too slow to matter, or so they thought. But arrogance is a fragile shield, and by spring, that shield began to crack. The turning point was not one great battle. It was not a dramatic shift on a single day. It was erosion, a slow, grinding loss of certainty. At first, a few pilots failed to return from missions, then a whole staffel, then two. The sky, once a canvas for German dominance, began to fill with silver, couldn't shake, couldn't shoot down. The Luftwaffe's early success had bred a dangerous confidence. Many of its aces had been flying since 1939, and some had over 100 kills under their belt. Men like Gerhard Barkhorn, Gunther Rall, and Erich Hartmann flew with a calm belief that they would always find a way back. They had survived the Eastern Front, the defense of the Reich, the attrition over the Channel. But in 1944, something changed. The air war no longer favored experience. It favored numbers. It favored logistics. It favored the relentless arrival of Mustangs. American bomber raids were increasing in frequency and scale, and with them came the P-51s, no longer peeling off at the Rhine, no longer disappearing when the fuel ran low. They were there, deep over enemy territory, escorting every formation, covering every angle, and staying longer than any fighter had before. German tactics began to fail. The standard head-on pass, so effective against unescorted bombers, became suicidal. Any pilot who lingered near the formations found himself flanked within seconds by swarming Mustangs. The radio calls became frantic. Achtung! Achtung! Fighter escort at 10 o'clock. Multiple. Fast. Climbing. Veteran German officers started noticing a shift in tone. Pilots were coming back shaken, even if they survived. There was no shame in the fear, only a growing sense of helplessness. The enemy was not just more aggressive, he was coordinated, organized, unstoppable. Pilots like Major Heinz Noke, who had once claimed over 30 kills, now found themselves flying defensive missions. Noke once wrote in his diary that he felt like a prey animal, constantly hunted, rarely allowed to hunt. Even when they downed a Mustang, two more seemed to take its place. Fuel shortages grounded units that had once flown daily. Training hours were cut in half. Aircraft maintenance became a guessing game. Meanwhile, the Americans just kept coming. Even
Most
the
hardened
German aces began to avoid confrontation when possible. Missions were flown at odd hours or low altitudes, hoping to stay beneath radar. Units relocated constantly, changing airfields every few days to avoid discovery. It was survival by evasion, not domination. In May of 1944, during a mission over France, an entire group of Focke-Wulf 190s failed to return. Only one pilot survived, parachuting into occupied territory with a broken arm. His report was chilling. He had not seen the enemy. He had only heard them, high above, beyond sight. And then suddenly, everywhere. By June, the fear was institutional. New recruits were rushed through flight school with barely 60 hours in the cockpit. Their instructors, some barely older than themselves, warned them not of tactics or maneuvers, but of how to recognize a Mustang silhouette and when to run. The average lifespan of a new Luftwaffe pilot in mid-1944 had dropped below 2 weeks, and still, the high command pushed for resistance. Radio orders barked demands for interception. Scramble protocols were launched at all hours, but inside the cockpits, the mood had shifted. The fire of 1940 had been replaced by dread. The pride of 1942 was now a whisper. The German fighter arm had begun to wither not from defeat, but from exhaustion. Every engagement cost them more than they could afford. A lost pilot was not just a man. He was months of training, fuel, aircraft parts, and irreplaceable experience. A downed Mustang was replaced within days. A downed Messerschmitt was mourned and never replaced. This imbalance began to manifest itself in behavior. Younger pilots refused to engage unless ordered directly. Some faked mechanical failures to avoid takeoff. One report described a squadron of new pilots who taxied out for launch, only to feign radio failure and return to the hangar claiming engine issues. The commanding officer knew they were lying, but what could he do? There were no more replacements. One mechanic at a base near Bremen wrote home to his wife saying, "We no longer repair aircraft to win. We repair them so someone can try to survive." By the end of the summer, Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were being consolidated. Aces were pulled from the front to train rookies, but morale was too far gone. Even the veterans began to falter. Erich Hartmann, the most successful fighter ace in history, would later admit that in 1945 he knew the war was lost. He still flew, still fought, but he no longer believed in victory. What once soared had now been grounded by the weight of inevitability. The myth of air superiority had become memory. The Luftwaffe was no longer a predator. It was a scattered flock, hunted from the sky, radio signals fading into silence, aircraft burning on cold runways, and pilots staring at maps with no safe route left to fly. If this reflection gave you insight into how power can slip away even from legends, leave your thoughts below and consider subscribing. Sharing these moments ensures they are never forgotten. It began as a sound, not a scream, not a roar, but a deep mechanical pulse that rolled across the sky like a distant avalanche of metal. It was too rhythmic to be thunder and too heavy to be wind. Those who heard it from the ground would pause, uncertain if the noise came from nature or machine. But for German pilots, the sound was instantly familiar and terrifying. It was the voice of the Mustang. By mid-1944, P-51, the sound of the had become something more than just the hum of an approaching enemy. It was a warning, a signature, a prophecy. You could hear it before you could see it. That was the worst part. A low droning, almost soothing in its consistency, until your instincts began to scream that something was wrong. It vibrated through the cockpit glass, echoed across valleys, and wrapped itself around the nerves of anyone trained to understand what came next. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots could tell the difference between aircraft just by the note of their engines. The higher-pitched whine of the Junkers Jumo, the throaty bark of a Focke-Wulf. But the Mustang was different. Its Packard-built Merlin engine had a tone that was deep, composed, and strangely emotionless. It didn't shriek into battle. It announced itself like a machine arriving to do its job. And when it got closer, that hum turned into something else, a rhythm. The chattering of .650 caliber Browning machine guns firing in tight bursts, Not wild, not chaotic, deliberate. Each trigger pull sending a stream of heavy rounds that tore aircraft apart in seconds. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the metallic rattle of German cannons or the stuttering zap of a Soviet yak. It was heavier, thicker, a thunderclap repeating at the exact tempo of death. To be caught in that sound was to know it might already be too late. Some called it the hammer. Others said it was like standing under a collapsing bridge. But every surviving German pilot from 1944 to 1945 spoke of that sound with the same tone. Not hatred, not even anger, just resignation. A pilot named Dietrich Kruger recalled being scrambled near Munich in August of '44. He never saw the Mustang that hit his wingman. He only heard the sound. 3 short bursts, a moment of silence, then flames. His comrade's aircraft fell in pieces before his eyes. He described the moment later with chilling simplicity. I heard the metal voice. Then there was nothing. It wasn't just pilots who learned to fear it. Farmers tending fields in central Germany began to recognize the sound of Mustangs strafing trains from miles away. Locals would pull their carts to the side and wait. Sometimes the planes would pass. Other times they would dive without warning, their guns chewing through rail cars and engines before vanishing back into the sky. Children began to refer to it as the whistling death. Even when the aircraft were too high to engage, their presence was felt through vibration alone. Church windows would tremble. Dogs would hide under porches. The sound had become a psychological weapon, and it didn't even need to fire to be effective. For German anti-air crews, it was worse. Radar stations could detect incoming formations, but the moment Mustangs showed up, panic followed. Black batteries were manned with trembling hands. Spotters called out coordinates that changed too quickly to track. And in the blur of incoming streaks, one emotion overwhelmed all. Others, not confusion, not rage, fear. Reports began to reach Berlin, not about the firepower, not even about the losses, but about the morale. Pilots were freezing in the air. Crews hesitated to engage. Whole squadrons avoided contact entirely. The sound of the P-51 had become synonymous with failure. Not because it was unbeatable, but because it didn't need to be. It simply arrived, it delivered, and it left. Even in places where no damage occurred, the psychological effect lingered. Allied intelligence picked up intercepted messages describing sightings of Mustangs where none had been sent. Ghost flights, shadows mistaken for wings. Entire missions were aborted based on sound alone. The Luftwaffe High Command attempted to reframe it as cowardice. They reprimanded officers. They accused pilots of imagining threats. But deep down, they knew. The thunder had spoken. It had reached beyond the physical battlefield and sunk into the subconscious of the German war machine. Every whistle of wind could be a Mustang. Every rumble of distant engines a prelude to attack. That kind of pressure corrodes discipline. It erodes strategy. And eventually, it breaks even the strongest foundation. One intelligence officer, after reviewing weeks of mission transcripts and ground reports, said it best. The Americans have industrialized fear. Their planes don't just fight, they haunt. And perhaps that was the truest mark of the P-51's impact. Not its range, not its speed, not even its confirmed kills, but the fact that it had transcended machinery. It was now a presence, a sound that announced itself long before it struck and lingered long after it disappeared. If stories like this echo something deep within you, leave your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing. The past has a voice, and you're helping keep it alive. The Mustang was never meant to be a legend. It began as a rush job. In April of 1940, the British approached North American aviation with a request. Build more P-40 Warhawks under license to supply the RAF. But NAA made a bold counteroffer. Give us 120 days, and we will design a brand new aircraft from scratch. Something better, faster, sleeker. The British agreed, and in just 102 days, the prototype rolled out of the hangar. At first, it was just another fighter. Clean lines, efficient design, a long nose housing an Allison engine. But the early Mustangs had one fatal flaw. Above 15,000 feet, they lost power. In the high altitudes where air battles were fought, they became underdogs. The Germans still laughed until the engine changed. The marriage of the Mustang airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was not just a modification, it was an evolution. Suddenly, the aircraft could climb higher, dive faster, and still fly over 1,800 miles with drop tanks. It could escort bombers to Berlin and back. It could outturn a Focke-Wulf and outrun a Messerschmitt. It was light, fast, lethal, and, most importantly, reliable. But its true power came not from performance alone. It came from how many could be built. America's industrial base, awakened by war, had become a sleeping giant with one task: produce faster than the enemy could destroy. Detroit, Chicago, Dallas, Long Beach, every assembly line that once made cars or appliances now turned out wings, engines, and rivets. By the end of the war, over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been manufactured. That's not just a number, that's a statement. The Mustang didn't need to be rare or exotic. It needed to be everywhere. Each aircraft followed a rhythm. The nose cones were painted, radios were tuned, guns were calibrated to converge at a specific range, usually 300 yards. Crews drilled, polished, checked hydraulics, topped off coolant, loaded ammo belts, and fueled the tanks. Then the engines fired, 6 at a time, then 12, then 24, echoing across the airfield like a mechanical choir. One by one, they took off with formation precision, circling high above the U clouds before heading east into the unknown. These machines weren't flown by mythical heroes. They were operated by young men, many barely out of high school. Men like Chuck Yeager, Bud Anderson, Roscoe Brown. Some had less than 200 hours of training before facing the Luftwaffe. But they were not alone. They flew with backup, with intelligence briefings, with radar coordination, with mechanics who worked through the night to patch bullet holes and replace landing gear. It was not one pilot versus one pilot. It was system versus system. And the system worked. The Mustang could loiter for hours. It could dive and climb in seconds. Its 6 Browning 50 caliber guns could fire over 1,300 rounds in less than 30 seconds. But what made it terrifying was not what it could do. It was that it never stopped doing it. Every mission completed meant another one ready the next morning. Planes were refueled within hours, damage repaired overnight, pilots debriefed, fed, and sent back to the air. German units, crippled by lack of fuel and spare parts, could only watch as new waves of polished silver streaks filled the sky, and each one looked exactly like the last. A German ground observer once wrote in his diary that watching American squadrons fly overhead was like seeing a machine reproduce itself mid-air, one after another, the same shape, the same roar, the same intent. You shoot one down, and 5 more return the next day. It was industrial war with wings. Inside Allied command centers, missions were plotted with chilling accuracy. The Mustang was not just a tool, it was a node in a network. Missions coordinated across squadrons, across time zones, across oceans. Logistics ensured fuel was waiting at emergency fields. Weather reports were relayed through encrypted channels. Replacement parts arrived before they were needed. If one squadron lost a plane, the next had 2 more standing by. Even its versatility was a testament to design. The Mustang could escort bombers at altitude, dogfight with fighters, and dive to strafe locomotives or columns of tanks. In Italy, they hunted German convoys along mountain passes. In France, they patrolled the skies after D-Day, keeping enemy aircraft from even approaching the front lines. And in Germany, they waited in silence above airfields, picking off anything that dared to take off. The Mustang had no single purpose. Its purpose was presence, and that presence reshaped the war. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons began avoiding contact entirely. They relocated under forest canopies. They flew only at dusk. Recon pilots disguised their flights as weather checks. But the Mustang did not blink. It patrolled. It listened. It responded. It was not a warrior. It was a constant. And constancy is what wins wars. The Germans had brilliance. They had the Me-262 jet, the rocket-powered Comet, the precision of engineering born from desperation. But what they lacked was breath. Their brilliance gasped for air. It broke down. It overheated. It stalled. It lacked fuel. The Mustang kept flying. And because it kept flying, the others stopped. In the end, it was not just a question of power. It was a question of rhythm. The Mustang matched the beat of a war machine that never skipped a note. While others adapted to survive, the Mustang arrived to conclude. If this journey through engineering and endurance gave you a new view on what victory can look like, drop a comment below and subscribe. The sky has stories to tell, and you are helping make sure they are not forgotten. In the early years of the war, German fighter pilots were gods in the sky. They carved their names into the clouds with smoke trails and confirmed kills, returning to base like gladiators from a well-earned duel. Pilots like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Adolf Galland were not just feared, they were revered. Their portraits hung in briefing rooms. Their tactics were studied like scripture, and their confidence untouchable. 1943, many of them had surpassed 100 aerial victories. Some had more. Hartmann would go on to claim over 350 kills, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history. But raw numbers alone don't tell the whole story. These men had survived against the Soviets, the British, the Americans. They were not just skilled. They were seasoned, hardened by years of aerial warfare. But in 1944, the sky began to change. The duels that once defined the air war turned into something colder, quieter, more mechanical. At first, the aces fought like they always had, head-on, aggressive, fearless. They engaged bomber streams with courage, often attacking alone or in pairs against dozens. For a while, they held their ground. Their skill gave them an edge. But the Mustangs brought something different, something the Luftwaffe had not encountered at scale. They brought redundancy. Aces could down one Mustang, maybe two, but there was always another, and another, and German pilots called it the Silver Wall. Flying in tight formations, the P-51s didn't break apart easily. They moved as a single organism, and when one was hit, others would cover the gap, retaliate, and close ranks before the hole could widen. This wasn't the fluid chaos of a dogfight. It was structured, relentless. Even the most experienced Luftwaffe veterans began to notice the pattern. The fights were no longer decided by reflex or instinct. They were decided by numbers and by time. Because the longer the fight lasted, the more likely it was the Mustang would win. Fuel was critical. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had powerful engines but short breath. Every climb drained the tank. Every loop burned time. In contrast, the P-51s could stay in the fight longer. They could pick their engagements. If outnumbered, they disengaged. If advantaged, they pounced. It changed the psychology of the fight. Where once the Luftwaffe aces had the initiative, now they were reacting, avoiding, calculating risk. In the summer of 1944, a squadron led by Gunther Rall, one of Germany's top aces, was ambushed over France. He managed to survive the engagement but lost several men. In a post-war interview, he described the moment simply. "I saw them high above, circling. We climbed. They waited. We reached their altitude, and they fell on us like a storm. We had no time to react." The Mustang's dominance was not just in firepower or flight ceiling. It was in patience. It could wait. Out, and that patience wore down the spirit of even the greatest. Adolf Galland, one of the most respected Luftwaffe commanders, had been skeptical of American air power. In the early years, he dismissed their tactics as wasteful and clumsy. But by 1944, he saw the writing on the wall. He began advocating for advanced jet fighters and better strategies to counter the overwhelming Allied advantage. He wasn't just worried about the numbers. He was worried about morale, because the fear was setting in. Not panic, not cowardice, but fatigue. The kind of fatigue that eats away at a pilot's edge. It starts with hesitation, a second of doubt before engaging, a glance at the fuel gauge, a twitch in the wrist when pulling the trigger, that moment where instinct is interrupted by calculation, when survival replaces glory. And in air combat, hesitation is death. More and more, German aces began flying with one eye on the horizon and one on the clock. They would engage only when absolutely. Some began avoiding bomber streams altogether. Others took lower altitude patrols, hoping to catch stragglers instead of confronting full escort wings. There were even reports of aces being grounded, not due to injury or illness, but to preserve them. High command knew their best pilots were becoming targets. The Allies had begun tracking individual call signs, identifying formations led by top scorers. American pilots were briefed on their names, their aircraft, their habits. The V-key hunter had become the hunted. One Mustang pilot described engaging a German formation led by a known ace. "We knew it was him. We had his tactics on file. He liked to dive from 12 o'clock high and split S under the bombers. We set a trap." The German ace never saw it coming. He was forced to bail out, captured on the ground. In that moment, the Luftwaffe lost more than a plane. It lost a symbol, because symbols only matter when they inspire. And by late 1944, inspiration was running low. Ace culture that once defined the Luftwaffe was now an echo. The romantic vision of the noble dogfight had faded into smoke trails and fuel shortages. Pilots still flew with bravery, but bravery alone wasn't enough anymore. The sky was now governed by efficiency, by coverage, by rhythm. And the Mustang had all three. It wasn't just beating the best, it was replacing them. Some pilots adjusted, others didn't. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace of all time, continued to fly. But even he began to limit his engagements. In one mission, he described circling a bomber stream, calculating wind and sun, searching for weakness, but never finding one. He returned without firing a shot, and that was the new normal. You could be the greatest pilot alive and still find yourself helpless against a system that didn't care about your medals. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm had become a relic, clashing against a future it could not contain. Not because it lacked courage, but because courage had been outproduced. If this glimpse into the fall of legends and the rise of a machine-driven war made you think deeper about what it means to endure, take a moment to leave a comment and subscribe. Your engagement helps these stories fly again. The Mustang did not win the war alone. Its wings were sharp, its engine powerful, and its guns devastating. Yes, but behind every P-51 that screamed across the sky was a nation that had transformed itself into a living, breathing war machine. What took flight over Europe was not just aluminum and fuel. It was the physical manifestation of a logistical miracle. Victory, in truth, began on the factory floor. In the cities of America, the hum of industry was relentless. In Detroit, automobile assembly lines once used to build Buicks now rolled out aircraft engines. In Long Beach, California, wings were riveted day and night under artificial lighting that mimicked daylight to keep production flowing. In Kansas City, women lined up shoulder to shoulder, not to sew clothes, but to wire control panels and install radio units. Every hand that turned a bolt was part of the silent chorus of war. At its peak, a Mustang could be built in just over 2.5 weeks from raw materials to final assembly. That speed was not coincidence, it was coordination. Trains brought steel, trucks delivered rubber, aluminum was melted and shaped in furnaces fed by coal shipped from the Appalachian mines. Entire towns existed solely to serve the war effort. This industrial rhythm beat like a second heart behind the front lines. Each P-51 that crossed the Atlantic had a trail of effort thousands of miles long. Fuel bladders stitched in Ohio, propellers forged in Connecticut, cockpit glass cut in Pennsylvania, pilots trained in Texas, spare parts crated in Illinois, and all of it timed, labeled, inventoried, shipped, and delivered with a precision that defied belief. It was not just mass production. It was orchestration. The Germans had engineers, brilliant ones. They built marvels like the Messerschmitt 262 and the V-2 rocket. But what they lacked was continuity. Factories were bombed, supply lines were strained, resources diverted, fuel rationed, skilled laborers drafted to the front. Every miracle of German engineering came at a growing cost. Meanwhile, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft engines in 1944 alone. The Luftwaffe lost planes faster than it could replace them. Pilots were forced to fly damaged aircraft, sometimes patched with improvised parts. Ammunition stocks ran low, tires wore out, radios failed. Each engagement became a gamble. Even when a German pilot survived, his aircraft might not be ready for the next day. But for the Americans, readiness was the default. Mustangs landed, refueled, rearmed, and returned to the sky within hours. Mechanics worked in synchronized teams, each with a clear task. Armament crews replaced spent belts. Technicians tuned engines. Hydraulics were checked, radios calibrated, wings inspected for damage. It was not repair, it was ritual. And when a Mustang was lost, its replacement was already in the pipeline. This industrial superiority was more than just convenience. It became strategy. Allied commanders could plan missions with the confidence that air cover would be available. Ground troops advanced, knowing that fighter bombers could be summoned with a radio call. Supply drops were coordinated with P-51 escorts flying Overwatch. Entire divisions moved. Under the safety net of American air dominance, German commanders noticed. One after-action report noted that the presence of American fighter patrols above a battlefield reduced the effectiveness of German ground forces by as much as 60%. Not because of casualties, but because of fear. Soldiers moved slower. Trucks avoided roads. Artillery units hesitated to fire, afraid of revealing their position. And in the sky, the pressure was worse. German pilots were ordered to attack Allied bombers despite overwhelming odds. But they knew the pattern. Climb too high, and the Mustangs would pounce. Dive too fast, and you would not have the altitude to return. Every sortie became a question of survival, not success. It was an invisible war, one fought not with bullets, but with exhaustion. The Luftwaffe could not rest. Every moment of silence was a moment preparing for the next wave, the next formation, the next sound of thunder from the west. German airfields were bombed in rotation. Runways cratered, hangars collapsed, replacement parts destroyed before they could be unpacked. Meanwhile, American bases in England operated like small cities. Cafeterias fed thousands. Hospitals patched up the wounded. Chapels held quiet services. Theaters showed films to pilots on rest rotation. The war was brutal, but the machine kept them human, and it kept them flying. The Mustang, in this sense, was not just a fighter. It was a delivery system for the American way of war. Fast, repetitive, calculated, backed by a production model that left no room for gaps, no time for hesitation, no possibility of collapse. This system created an impossible dilemma for the Germans. Even if they won a battle, the war continued without pause. Even if they destroyed a squadron, another stood ready to replace it. Even if they devised new tactics, the Mustang adapted faster than they could implement them. The Luftwaffe was bleeding not just from combat losses, but from the slow constriction of American logistics. It was not the roar of engines that strangled them. It was the sound of gears turning, trucks unloading, cranes lifting, clipboards checking boxes, the machinery of victory. And the longer it operated, the more silent the German sky became. If the scale of this invisible war behind the war opened your eyes to the depth of what true power looks like, leave your reflections below and subscribe to support content like this. Every click, every share helps keep the pulse of history alive. The color of the sky had changed. It was not poetic. It was not abstract. It was real, visible, measurable. The very shade above Europe had shifted by 1945, and those who had once ruled the clouds were now staring upward at something they could no longer touch. A German pilot, captured after bailing out over Austria, said something that lingered in the minds of Allied interrogators. He stared at the ceiling and muttered, almost to himself, "The sky used to be gray. It was ours. But now, it's silver, and we do not belong in it anymore." That silver hue did not come from the weather. It came from metal, from the polished skin of hundreds of Mustangs circling above in tight formations, from their drop tanks catching the sun like mirrors, from contrails stretching across the horizon in parallel lines of discipline. The sky was no longer a place of contest. It was a corridor of inevitability, and everyone on the ground could see it. What had once been a domain shared by aces and legends had become a one-way street. Movement was monitored. Climbing was punished. Radio silence meant survival. The Luftwaffe, which had once drawn pride from daring maneuvers and high-altitude duels, was now grounded by the sheer presence of American air power. Because presence was no longer symbolic, it was total. Villages in eastern Germany began tracking the passage of Mustang patrols the way one might track weather patterns. They knew when they came, how they moved, how long they stayed. Not by sight, but by sound. A certain low harmony in the sky, a particular glint that made people stop and look up. Farmers began painting their roofs in muted tones to avoid reflection. Children were told not to wave at the planes. They had become a constant reminder that something was watching. It was not enough to hide. The Mustang could see. Reconnaissance variants, fitted with high-resolution cameras, flew deep into Axis territory with near impunity. They captured troop movements, supply columns, rail depots, even camouflaged bunkers. The Germans tried to adapt. They shifted convoys to night routes. They disguised trucks as farm vehicles. They built decoy airfields made of wood and canvas. But the silver eyes above saw everything. Even when they did not fire, they altered the battlefield. German ground commanders hesitated to move units in daylight. Artillery crews paused after every shot, fearing retaliation. Trains ran on shortened schedules. Their operators trained to brake instantly and abandon cars at the first sound of engines overhead. Paranoia set in like fog, clinging to every decision. Speed was death. Visibility was death. Sound was death. The Luftwaffe knew the feeling well. Pilots began flying lower, much lower, sometimes barely a few hundred feet off the ground, hugging forests and river valleys just to avoid detection. But this created new dangers. Trees, power lines, terrain. Accidents began claiming more pilots than enemy fire. And when they did climb, they climbed into a trap. Because the Mustang owned altitude, it was there first. It chose when to engage. It chose when to retreat. It dictated tempo. A young German pilot in 1945 was said to have joked grimly during a briefing, "If you see the Mustang first, you live. If the Mustang sees you first, you die. If you don't see it at all, you were already dead." But behind the bitterness was truth. Even the veterans who had survived since 1940 began to understand that they were not adapting fast enough. The Luftwaffe's doctrine was built on initiative, on controlling space. But initiative requires opportunity, and opportunity requires oxygen. The Mustang had taken that oxygen away, and it was not alone. It worked in tandem, with bombers, with artillery, with ground troops, with radios transmitting coordinates, with radar stations relaying altitudes. It was not just a fighter. It was the sharp end of a spear held by an entire continent. A few German pilots still tried to fight, still climbed into the cold air with engines trembling and hope stretched thin. They still dove on bomber formations, still pulled the trigger, still hit their marks. But each success felt smaller, less significant. One Mustang down did not change the war. 10 did not. 50 did not. Because for every Mustang destroyed, another came to take its place. The war had moved beyond the age of individuals. No longer could a single ace shift the tide. No longer could tactical genius outmaneuver volume. The P-51 represented a new era, an era where the sky was not earned with honor, but held with pressure. Relentless, mechanical, industrial pressure. The kind that does not blink. In the final months of the war, the Germans began deploying jet fighters, the Me-262, sleek, fast, deadly. It could outrun the Mustang in a straight line. It could strike before the Americans even saw it coming. But it had one fatal flaw. It needed a runway, and the Mustang watched runways. Anytime the Me-262 tried to land or take off, the P-51s were waiting, strafing, bombing, forcing pilots to land in fields or risk destruction. So even the future of aviation, the next generation of air power, was pinned to the dirt by the wings of yesterday's machine. The sky, once infinite, had become narrow. It was no longer a space of possibility. It was a ceiling, and for those on the wrong side, it felt heavier with every passing day. If this journey through the shrinking horizon and the psychological weight of dominance gave you something to reflect on, leave your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing. These stories are more than history. They are warnings etched in vapor and steel. It ended in silence. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of surrender, but the strange, mechanical stillness that comes when even the machines have nothing left to do. By April of 1945, the Luftwaffe was not defeated in the way textbooks usually describe. It had not fallen in a final blaze of glory, nor collapsed in a single moment of failure. It had simply ceased to exist. Its frequencies, once crackling with orders, alerts, and frantic reports, were now empty. The same radios that once guided fighter aces across the skies now hummed with static. There were no calls for interception, no formations requesting landing clearance, no chatter between squadrons, just a dead signal, stretched thin across the airwaves. It was not interference, it was absence, and into that absence came the Mustang. There were no longer enough planes to stop it, no longer enough pilots to fight it. The last outposts that tried to resist were isolated, flying on outdated fuel and stripped-down aircraft with patched-up wings and tired hands on the controls. They knew it was over, but they flew anyway. One American pilot, flying over southern Germany in those final weeks, wrote in his journal, "It felt like flying over a graveyard, not the kind with tombstones, the kind with echoes. There was no more resistance in the sky, only movement, observation, supervision." The P-51s patrolled the ruins of the Luftwaffe, not as hunters, but as shepherds of a new order. They weren't searching for targets. They were ensuring nothing else could rise. The thunder that once marked their arrival now echoed without opposition. On the ground, German civilians looked up at the silver formations and no longer flinched. They knew these planes no longer came to destroy. They came to witness the end. The bombing, raids had slowed. The front lines were closing in, and as towns surrendered one after another, the P-51s flew above like silent sentinels. In some villages, children waved again, not in defiance, not in desperation, but in understanding, because the war, at least from above, had passed. Inside the Allied command centers, no celebration erupted at the silence of the Luftwaffe. There was no trumpet, no drum roll, just maps marked with fewer enemy sightings, reports stamped with "no contact," intelligence logs with entire pages blank. The air war had simply stopped. It was the end of something enormous, something that had begun with pride and invention and theory, and ended with exhaustion, repetition, and silence. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of lightning-fast conquest and technical innovation, had been ground down to vapor. Not by one weapon, not by one plane, but by a strategy rooted in patience and pressure. And the P-51 Mustang was its most visible instrument. The Mustang won with romance. It won with consistency, with system, with presence. It showed up every day, escorted every mission, drove the enemy into hiding, and then waited until the enemy stopped responding. By May of 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh at the Mustang, no technicians to reinforce its myth, no commanders to adapt their strategy. The sky belonged to the machine, to the engine, to the rhythm of mass production. The final victories were not measured in kills, but in absence. The absence of contact, the absence of fear, the absence of war itself. And so, the thunder ceased not with applause, but with understanding. It had spoken, and the world had heard. To everyone who stayed through this journey, who listened closely to the hum beneath history, thank you. These stories matter not because of the machines, but because of what they represent: effort, sacrifice, scale, and the cold, inevitable logic of a war that rewarded endurance more than brilliance. This series moved you. If it painted the sky a little differently in your imagination, take a moment to leave a comment. We read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, stories that don't just tell, but reveal, click that subscribe button. The next video is already waiting for you on screen. Another forgotten tale, another hidden chapter. Because history never ends. It only echoes. And sometimes that echo sounds like thunder.